And good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Schwartz on Sports here on Sports.com. I'm your host, Peter Schwartz, with you every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time right here on Sports.com. On tonight's show, we're going to talk NBA with the beat writer for the New York Knicks for the New York Post, Mark Berman. Mark also has his hands on the pulse of the entire NBA, so we'll talk a little hoops with him in a couple of minutes. Then a little bit later on in the show, we're going to talk about a brand new book that a lot of Mets and baseball fans in general will get a kick out of. We'll talk to Howie Carpin, who has authored the new book, 162-0, Imagine a Mets Perfect Season. We'll tell you about that a little bit later on in the show, and we'll talk to Mark Berman about the NBA. But first, we start with our opening tip, and I know this is a couple of days after the fact, but we obviously have to start with the big news that happened this week, which really transcends anything that we ever have to talk about in sports, and that is the death of Osama bin Laden and how it really relates to sports and what we talk about here on the show and what any sportscaster has been talking about since that terrible day almost 10 years ago. And I think a lot of people rejoiced on Sunday night when we found out the news. There was a big reaction in Philadelphia where the Mets were playing the Phillies, and we heard the Philly fans yelling USA, USA, USA. And that moment, 9/11, and what had happened almost 10 years ago really hit the sports world hard. And I can't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I could tell you where I was on 9/11. I had just started working for ESPN Radio in New York, and we had just signed on the New York Islanders hockey team. It was the first team that signed with our radio station. So I was on my way up to Lake Placid, New York that morning to cover training camp. And I was just past Albany. I was driving from Long Island, out on Long Island, up to Lake Placid. And for those who aren't familiar with the New York geography, it's a few hours drive up to Lake Placid from Long Island. And I'm just past Albany, just past the state capital of New York, when word came on the radio that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And then we realized it was not an accident, it was not a small plane, that it was a big plane that had hit the World Trade Center. And then a few minutes later, the second plane hits the World Trade Center. Now you know that there's an issue going on. And obviously, when I finally did get up to training camp, because you couldn't turn around to go back to New York because New York City was shut down, you couldn't get in or out. I made my way up to Lake Placid, and obviously, you know, hockey was the last thing on a lot of people's minds that morning that were already up there. So it had hit the hockey world hard, but of course, it would make big news in baseball because baseball shut down for a week. And it came back here in the New York area with the Mets on September 21st and Mike Piazza hitting that incredible home run against the Braves. And then, of course, the Yankees went on another run to the World Series, lost in 7 games to Arizona. So you remember where you are with these types of things. And with me, it obviously relates to sports because it's what I do for a living. And now, almost 10 years later, we're talking about the guy who was responsible for what happened that morning is no longer on the earth. And I think that's a good thing. But let's keep one thing in mind. As we're all rejoicing about what happened and the fact that finally, almost 10 years later, our troops got the guy that was responsible for the death of almost 3,000 innocent people, let's remember this. There is no closure to this thing. There is no closure because we still talk about it all the time. And no matter how many of these terrorists, how many of these bad guys, as my son Bradley would like to say, are out there, the bottom line is the killing of Osama bin Laden is not going to bring back those 3,000 people. And I think at a time like this, as much as we are rejoicing the death of bin Laden, I think it's also a time to sit back once again and reflect over those people who were lost that day. And I'm fortunate I didn't know anybody in any of the plane crashes. I'm very, very fortunate that I didn't know anybody, but I know people who did lose people. So yeah, at this time, not so much rejoicing over Osama bin Laden dying, but it's also a time to think back and reflect on those people who were lost and the loved ones that they left behind. And from a sports standpoint, there were sports people involved on that plane. There was a scout and I think 2 scouts for the Los Angeles Kings on one of the flights that went down. So it hit the sports world hard. We used sports as a sense of an escape from reality in the days and the months and the years after that. And now that bin Laden is dead, it's another chance for us to kind of think back to what happened that day and remember how lucky we all are to live in the United States of America. As our president said the other night in his speech, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Well, I'm the last person that should really be talking about politics. Let's talk a little sports. When we come back, we'll talk NBA, we'll talk New York Knicks with Mark Berman of the New York Post when we come back here on Schwartz on Sports right after this.
Welcome to sports. My name is Greg Dorman, and this is Rally Notes.
Racing fans, don't forget that on Thursdays at 7 p.m., it's time for Rally Notes. Greg Dorman, rally racing co-driver from Klein Racing, hosts guests and takes your calls about the entire automotive industry, rally racing, and auto racing in general. Rally racing is a great sport. They have Subarus and all sorts of off-road, all-wheel drive vehicles that run through the mud and the backlogging roads. But he's not only talking rally, he'll talk all sorts of racing and automobiles as well. We'll test cars, we'll drive cars, and we'll have a lot of fun. Rally Notes, 7 p.m. on Thursday. Don't miss it.
I'm Justin Tucker, the New York Giants, and you're watching Sports.com.
Everything sports, you got to go to sports.com. That's spelled SPORTCE.com. We're going to take you behind the scenes in the world of sports and a lot more. It's sport, content, and entertainment. We got a lot of great stuff. Technology segments.
Now it's got the front and back facing cameras, so you can do video chats like this one via Skype on the 3G network, and you can do FaceTime, only available on the Wi-Fi. It's got a lot of other great features. You can edit on it with iMovie. You can make songs and voiceovers.
Behind the scenes.
We back, sports.com, at this secret location, behind the scenes, Jim Jones.
We'll take you into the lives of athletes, follow them off the field, but it's also music.
Be right here, but it's perfect day.
And other genres as well. Check us out, sports.com, and we've got live shows 5 days a week. A lot of live shows with live guests in our New York City studios. We've got Rally Notes at 7 p.m. on Thursday nights, The Warning Track, 6 p.m. on Friday nights, Schwartz on Sports with esteemed broadcaster Peter Schwartz, 8 p.m. on Tuesday nights, and on Wednesdays, it's The Music Movement with Darryl Reed. Check us out, sports.com.
We are right smack in the middle of the NBA playoffs into round two, and on the line to talk about the NBA playoffs and the team he covers for the New York Post, the New York Knicks, we welcome in Mark Berman. Mark, Peter Schwartz, how are you?
Hey, doing great, Peter. Thanks for having me on.
Mark, thanks for coming on for a few minutes. We'll talk about the NBA playoffs and the entire landscape of the NBA in a minute or two, but let's start with the team that you cover that made the playoffs this year, and they were ousted in 4 straight games by the Celtics in the first round. That's the New York Knicks. And after so many years of not making the playoffs, do you consider, even though they got swept in the first round, was this a successful season for the Knicks?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, if they got swept and they were healthy, I'd have some reservations, but we'll never know how good they could have been if they were fully healthy in that first round. Stoudemire playing the final 3 games with the bad back, and Billups missing those final 3 games. But they have those 3 guns right now, Anthony, Stoudemire, and Billups, to build around, and Donnie Walsh has a lot of work ahead of him to get more pieces to build the depth and to get a center on this roster. But, yeah, they made nice strides, and, you know, first playoff berth since 2004. I just wish they could have been healthy against Boston, because I think they could have given them a run for their money.
There was a lot of talk maybe that they were not going to bring Chauncey Billups back. They had an option to bring him back or let him become a free agent, but he became a huge part. You know, at first he was a throw-in the Carmelo Anthony trade, but he wound up playing a huge part. He did have some injury issues. Obviously, the last 3 games of the playoffs he missed, but they do elect to bring him back. Is this an indication of how much they think of him, or is this just a stopgap until they maybe make a run at Chris Paul after next year?
Well, the master plan has been to make the run at Chris Paul in 2012. The concern is Billups going to be healthy next season? They really want to have a big year next year. I mean, they want to not just make the playoffs. They want to make another step, get into the second round and contend for the conference finals. And a lot will be depending on how Chauncey Billups holds up physically. He's going to be 35. Tony Douglas has proven he's really not a starting point guard. He's more of a combo guard. But yeah, they can also use Chauncey's contract as trade bait next season if Chris Paul does go on the block. But again, the Knicks still have to get very lucky with this free agent stuff in 2012 and this summer in 2011. Donnie Walsh really has quite a job still to do.
Now, we know that Chauncey Billups is going to be back. The question is the guy that pulled off the trade to bring him and Carmelo Anthony. And that, of course, is Donnie Walsh, the Knicks president. Is he going to be back next year? There was some talk that he was going to sit down with Knicks owner James Dolan in the foreseeable future to talk about that. In your mind, is Donnie Walsh going to come back and try and continue or even finish the job that he started?
Yeah, I mean, we reported last week that he did speak with Dolan. They had a very good talk, and they're close to a deal. Nothing has been announced yet, but I'm told from sources that things look really good. Donnie doesn't want to go into retirement off a 4-game sweep in the first round, and he is motivated now to continue building this team because they lost a lot of pawns in that Carmelo trade. So Walsh is very meticulous, and he's taking his time with this decision, but all sources are saying that he would return next year.
And Mark, last thing on the Knicks before we turn to the rest of the NBA. Mike D'Antoni has come under fire by Knicks fans and the media this year because he finally had a team that had a chance to win, but he is still under fire for the team's lack of consistent defense and maybe some of his X's and O's decisions late in games. Does Mike D'Antoni deserve another year, and does he come back on the hot seat next year?
Well, he'll definitely be on the hot seat next season, but he's been told by Donnie, that he'll be back. Donnie is a big fan of his still. He would like him to play a bigger lineup at times. He'd obviously like him to be more defensive oriented, but he takes the blame for the roster being shuffled so many times during his 3 seasons. I believe D'Antoni's coached 56 players in 3 years, which is a tremendous amount. And, Donnie takes the blame for it. Even going into this season, they thought there would be more stability. They thought Anthony would become a free agent and they wouldn't be this crazy trade in February. So Donnie really likes him and still has faith in him. But next season, it's his last year of his contract. If he doesn't get it done, he's gone.
We're talking to Mark Berman of the New York Post. He covers the Knicks and the NBA for the New York Post, and you're watching Schwartz on Sports here on Sports.com. Mark, let's turn our attention now to the NBA playoffs that are into its second round right now, and the series that everybody wanted to see, the Celtics and the Heat in round 2. Game 1 went to the Heat. Do you expect a long, dragged-out, rock'em sock'em series between these two clubs?
I'm not sure. Miami was leading in Game 2 before I got on the phone. Pierce had a little bit of an ankle thing, but going into the series, yes, I expected it to be possibly 6-7 games. I will say that Miami is looking very, very strong. They're really coming together. Dwayne Wade had a terrific Game 1. It would not surprise me if Miami won in 5 or 6 games. Boston did not impress me fully against the Knicks. In fact, those first 2 games they should have lost. They gained some momentum in the final 2 games against the Knicks. But I'll tell you, Miami is starting to really show what they can do. And I'd be surprised if the Celtics won that series.
And out in the other series, you've got the favorites lost all 3 Game 1s. The Bulls lost Game 1. Oklahoma City dropped their opener. And the Lakers last night blew a big lead in the second half in losing to Dallas. Of those 3, which one stunned you the most?
Probably the Lakers losing to Dallas. But I still think the Lakers are going to come back and win that series. Kobe Bryant, he could have won the game at the end. And I think he's, although he's been very hard on himself, saying he's not a clutch player anymore, I think the Lakers are going to come back. the Memphis Grizzlies are becoming the best story right now in the NBA, and ex-Knick Zach Randolph was called by Kevin Durant the best power forward in basketball. He looks ugly on the court. He's very unorthodox, but he is powering the Grizzlies after beating San Antonio and taking Game 1 from Oklahoma. I can't wait for tonight to see what they do in Game 2. A great, great story. The Bulls are vulnerable to me, and I'm not going to be stunned if Atlanta wins that series. The Bulls did have the best record in basketball, but this is the playoffs. This is Tom Thibodeau's first playoff. That series could go either way.
Derrick Rose, despite the loss in Game 1, Derrick Rose wins the NBA MVP award. To me, he was the most consistent player start to finish in the league. Do you agree with that? You think he deserved to be the NBA's most valuable player?
Without a doubt. I mean, the Bulls are not the Heat, and they had a better record than the Heat. When Derrick was at the Garden late in the season, just a couple of weeks ago, he put on such a show. He looked like a mini Jordan. It's just amazing how he has turned, not just become a floor general, but he makes these spectacular highlight plays that just lifts that team. He's such a good leader. He's done everything for that franchise. He easily deserved MVP.
No question about it. Last thing, Mark, before we let you go, and obviously everyone's excited about the playoffs and the road to the NBA Finals, but the NBA is about to embark in the same territory that the NFL is going through right now, and that is the threat of a lockout in the NBA at the end of this season. And things are not looking good. David Stern has not had many promising things to say about the talks. Billy Hunter hasn't really spoken that much about it. In your mind, do you think, as a lot of people think, do you think the league is heading towards work stoppage Armageddon?
Unfortunately, I do. Speaking to the players and some NBA officials, it looks like it's going that way. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if this is a repeat of 1999, another 50-game season. With this season beginning sometime in December or January. I would not be shocked at all. I would hate to see it. This sport is going so great. It's a shame that some of these NBA owners are crying poverty. The problem is the NBA owners, the ones that are losing money, they want the lockout. They would rather not see a season than lose money, and that's the biggest threat right now.
It would be a terrible thing to happen. It's awful what's going on in the NFL right now, and it would be a shame for it to happen in the NBA. Mark, thanks so much for joining us for a few minutes. Enjoy the rest of the playoffs. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right, thanks so much, Peter. Take it easy.
All right, thank you, Mark. Mark Berman from the New York Post. He covers the Knicks and the NBA. When we come back here on Schwartz on Sports, we'll switch gears. We'll talk baseball with the author of a new book, 162-0. Imagine a Mets perfect season. We'll talk to Howie Carpin next right here on Schwartz on Sports on Sports.com.
Welcome to Sports. My name is Greg Dorman, and this is Rally Notes.
Racing fans, don't forget that on Thursdays at 7 p.m., it's time for Rally Notes. Greg Dorman, rally racing co-driver from Klein Racing, hosts guests and takes your calls about the entire automotive industry, rally racing, and auto racing in general. Rally racing is a great sport. They have Subarus and all sorts of off-road, all-wheel drive vehicles that run through the mud and the backlogging roads. But he's not only talking rally, he'll talk all sorts of racing and automobiles as well. We'll test cars, we'll drive cars, and we'll have a lot of fun. Rally Notes, 7 p.m. on Thursday. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Schwartz on Sports here on Sports.com. I'm your host, Peter Schwartz, with you every Tuesday at 8 o'clock Eastern Time right here on Sports.com. We're going to switch gears now, talk a little baseball, and talk about a brand new book that has just been released. It is called 162-0. Imagine a Mets perfect season. And on the line with us right now, a longtime sports reporter. here in the New York area. He's also an official scorer for both the Mets and the Yankees. He is Howie Karp. And Howie, Peter Schwartz, how are you?
Hello.
Hey, Howie, how are you?
Good to be on with you, Pete.
All right, thanks. Good to have you on. Thanks for coming along for a few minutes tonight. Tell everyone about the book and the premise for 162-0 and what the book is all about.
Well, it's an historical / fantasy concept. What we did was we took the baseball calendar season from April to October, which is 180 days. They play 162 and 180. And we found a game on each date. It basically adds up to 162. Tried to find the best game on each date. Obviously, there's some off days in there, but like, for example, Tom Seaver's near perfect game in July, and then in April we had his 19 strikeout game. So it's basically a win on each date of the calendar season. Each game really doesn't have to interact with each other, but it adds up to 162 wins in 1 year.
And I would imagine throughout the course of a season and throughout the course of the Mets' history that there would probably be a couple of dates where either they never played or never won a game. Did you run into that issue at all?
No, I didn't. I basically made a list of 100. I had 180 some odd games, and then I cut down the list to make it 162. So it wasn't difficult to find a game on each date. There may have been some dates I was scraping, a little bit, but I found the game. It wasn't like a stretch to find a game on each date.
I think a poignant game to talk about that you mentioned in the book, and I think it's obviously imperative that we discuss in light of what happened a couple of days ago and the death of Osama bin Laden, is to talk about a very famous Met game that happened 10 days after 9/11, and that was on September 21st, 2001, and that was the night that Mike Piazza hit that big home run against Steve Karsay and the Braves at Shea Stadium in the 8th inning to lift the Mets to the victory, and that had to be a no-brainer for you. I mean, we all were there that night. A lot of us that have been covering sports in the New York area for a long time, we were all there. We felt the impact of 9/11 just from a personal standpoint. But that night at Shea Stadium, whether you were a Met fan or not a Met fan, whether you were a reporter or not a reporter, that night was very special.
Yeah, it was. It was one of the most incredible evenings I've ever spent at the ballpark. So, yeah, that one was right up front as far as making the list. The whole atmosphere was surreal, as you remember. It's something we don't want to go through again, I'm sure. But, the fact that home run was hit so late in the game to give them a come-from-behind win, if it was a routine game where they won like 7-0, it still would have been special.
Right.
But the way it went down and the guy who hit the home run, who was the face of the franchise at that time, I mean, everything just came together to make it a totally special night.
Yeah, you almost felt like he was going to hit the home run. There was so much excitement in the air that night when he stepped to the plate. And poor Steve Karsay, he's from the New York area, and you almost had to feel for him that he was in that position, and he delivered that ball that Piazza would hit out and hit off that TV tower in center field.
Yeah, it was almost like with all due respect to the Braves that night, it was almost like the Mets had to win that game because it was the first game back. It was the first sporting event in New York since the 9/11 disaster, and it was almost as if they had to win that game to make it a really symbolic and make the comeback official so people could get back to some normalcy, and luckily it worked out that way.
We're talking to Howie Karp. He is the author of a new book, 162-0, Imagine a Mets Perfect Season. That book is available right now. We'll get the info on Howie on how you can get it in just a couple of minutes. But another game that struck me in looking through the book, it actually was a game that I was at in April of 1983. You mentioned Tom Seaver in his near-perfect game before, but in April of 1983, Tom Seaver returned to the Mets for a second tour of duty, and he pitched on opening day, and the Mets won via the shutout. And that was a very emotional day, too, as the Met fans welcomed back Tom Seaver that day.
Yeah, that was a tremendous day. I was there for that game, too. I was lucky enough to be there. Seaver had been taken in this bogus compensation draft that they had for free agents being signed away, and the Mets did not protect him. They had to protect a certain amount of players that couldn't be picked, and they never anticipated that another team would take him, so they left him unprotected, and then he got taken away from them at that point. Then he came back, and everyone was going crazy at that point. I take that back. He wasn't taken in the draft. It was his first time back. He's actually taken after that, my mistake. But he did come back. He hadn't been with them. He was traded to the Reds in '77, and then it was his first time back. I remember him walking in from the bullpen because a lot of times, a guy just walks in. It depends on the guy and how the crowd reacts. And it was an opening day crowd; they were all there. It was a pretty nice day, from what I remember.
It was.
We got a huge ovation walking in from the right field bullpen.
Yeah, I remember it well, like it was yesterday. Talk about, there's so many moments in the book, the playoff moments, the grand single off the bat of Robin Ventura. There were some of the World Series games that you listed in there. Give me, when you were putting the book together and you were going through those 180 games, give me a moment that's in the book, a game that's in the book that may be unheralded by a lot of Met fans that you thought was important to put in there.
Well, this game wasn't unheralded, but what happened before the game was pretty notable that everyone forgets about. It was in September of '73. The ball on the wall miracle, Dave Augustine hitting that ball off the left field wall that came back into Cleon Jones, and they threw Richie Zisk out at the plate to preserve a huge win down the stretch that year because they ended up in the playoffs. Before that game, the great Willie Mays announced his retirement. Wow. That was his last year. He was down. Obviously, he was on the very downside of his career. Before that game, he actually announced his retirement. There was a ceremony and everything, and then that game was played, and that turned out to be one of the most notable games of the '73 season.
It certainly was. Howie Carpenter is our guest here on Schwartz on Sports on Sports.com, talking about 162-0. Imagine a Mets perfect season. David Wright, currently of the Mets, writes the foreword in the book, and not to give away too many things, but he writes about how so difficult it would be for a team to go 162-0 in a baseball season. Just the nature of the game doesn't allow for something like that to happen. But I think Met fans right now would settle for 81-81 the way things have been going for the Mets these days.
Yeah, they would. They're having a lot of problems with the current team on the field. They've had a lot of bad things happen to them in the last 5 years. I mean, 5 years ago, they're one inning away from the World Series, and everyone thought they were on an upswing. Then came the great collapse of '07, a second collapse in '08, and it's been all downhill since there, and they're really scrambling, spinning their wheels trying to get back on track these days.
Well, Howie, the book looks great. In flipping through it and reading a lot of the game stories, it's a great read. It's a great read for Met fans and for baseball fans everywhere. It'd be interesting to get people's opinions on what it would be like to experience your team going through 162-0. It's a wonderful book. Best of luck with it. How can people get a copy of the book if they are interested in doing so?
Well, it's in bookstores right now. Barnes & Noble, Borders, and all those places. And you can also get it online. Amazon.com. There's a lot of places online you can get it. Just Google the title, and you'll see a lot of websites that are offering the book. So if people want to get it, there's various ways they can reach out and get it.
Howie, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book. I'll see you at the ballpark soon.
All right, buddy. Good luck with the show. All
right, thank you, Howie. Howie Carpenter, noted author of a few baseball books, and the most current one, the one we were just talking about, 162-0. Imagine a Mets perfect season. Howie, also a longtime sports reporter here in New York and also an official scorer for the Mets and the Yankees. We'll come back with Pete's perspective to close it out right after this.
Welcome to Sports. My name is Greg Dorman, and this is Rally Notes.
Racing fans, don't forget that on Thursdays at 7 p.m., it's time for Rally Notes. Greg Dorman, rally racing co-driver from Klein Racing, hosts guests and takes your calls about the entire automotive industry, rally racing, and auto racing in general. Rally racing is a great sport. They have Subarus and all sorts of off-road, all-wheel drive vehicles that run through the mud and the backlogging roads. But he's not only talking rally, he'll talk all sorts of racing and automobiles as well. We'll test cars, we'll drive cars, and we'll have a lot of fun. Rally Notes, 7 p.m. on Thursday. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to the program. It's Peter Schwartz with you. Schwartz on Sports here on Sports.com. Closing this episode out for this Tuesday evening with you every Tuesday night at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. At the beginning of the show, we started out talking about the death of Osama bin Laden and how the sadness of 9/11 related to the sports world. So I think it's only fitting that we end the show on a brighter note. And this Sunday, of course, is Mother's Day. And I just wanted to take the close of the show to thank and wish Happy Mother's Day to 3 very special ladies in my life. And of course, we're going to start with my wife, Cheryl, who is just amazing. And I love her very, very much. And she is probably the best mom on the planet. And I know 3 great moms that I want to say Happy Mother's Day to. And of course, in addition to my wife, Cheryl, to my mother, Ruth, and to my mother-in-law, Gail, 3 very special women. And Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there on your special day on Sunday. I want to thank our guests here on the show. On the show tonight, Howie Carpin, the author of 162-0, Imagine the Mets' Perfect Season. Mark Berman writes for the New York Post, covers the Knicks and the NBA. Thanks to both of them. We'll see you right back here for another edition of Schwartz on Sports next Tuesday, 8 o'clock Eastern Time, right here on Sports.com.